Okay, welcome to our Constitution Day program. My name is Jonathan Frater. I'm the Director of Library Services at MCNY. According to the United States Department of Education, each educational institution that receives federal funding for a fiscal year is required to hold an educational program about the U.S. Constitution for its students on September 17th. Obviously, this year, September 17th falls on a weekend, and so we do the generally mandated thing, which is we push our program to the next available day, which is today, Monday the 18th. And so the idea that we went with for this year's program was the history and mythology of the United States Constitution, which I came to very strictly as the fact that I recognize that I've been living in this country for almost 57 years, and I have only the vaguest idea of what the Constitution actually says. It's the highest law of the land, but we don't generally teach it very well or very often in any of the K-12 environments that I've ever worked in. So today I'm hoping that we can have a bit of a discussion and get some of those basics out into the air where they belong so that we can appreciate exactly what the history of the U.S. Constitution is and why so many people apparently have so many misconceptions about it. I want to welcome my panelists, Professor Patrick Ianniello, Professor Roberta Youngblood, Professor Wallace Ford, and Professor Mark Wald. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to get this started by asking if together we can come up with an introduction to the concept of constitutional law. What is it? Why are we using it as opposed to any other kind of law to manage our country? And what's the history of that, if we can get into that a little bit?
Well, I'll start. I think one of the interesting things about the Constitution and the form of government we have is the fact that at the time of the forming of the United States, there had been no other democracy on the face of the earth through our history. So this is all an experiment. And when we first get started after the Revolutionary War to put together some type of government amongst the 13 colonies, as we'll get into a deeper discussion about the Articles of Confederation and then ultimately into what our Constitution then becomes our form of government as far as how the states interact with each other.
Yeah, I'd also point out that the Constitution of the United States is actually kind of a second try at having a government of any sort of federal government, a national government of any sort. It is, his history is funny, but when you look through the lens of history, or history as was told during the time, the fact that there is even something called a United States is not a done deal. Certainly with the surrender of the British, Yorktown, and all of that good stuff, because you had a committee of sorts running the war, but certainly not the individual states in any real respect. What was clear is that whatever form of government there was going to be, there was a need for some kind of national government, because you couldn't have a in a New York quarter and expect to have a useful economy. You couldn't have the New Jersey ambassador to France and the Massachusetts ambassador to France going together, and obviously you needed a united military. So people kind of agreed on that need for it. The question became, what was the government going to look like? I think we are looking through the lens of history from 230 something years, the notion that it was supposed to be a representative government and that all men are created equal and all that really is just not true. And that's not who they were. We can talk a little bit more about who they were, the framers of the Constitution. But it's important to understand that before the Constitution, there was the Articles of Confederation that didn't work. So there was a need for a central government of some strength, but not too much strength. And they said that's when the fight started. And we've been watching that battle literally take place to this very day, as terms of the power of the states as opposed to the power of the national government, with the recognition. And I don't know of any other democracy in the world where the local government, not local, but the regional government or whatever, provincial government or state government have as much power as they do here in the United States. You just don't have that in France. You don't have it in England, and so on. So I welcome engaging in a conversation about just how we got to where we are, but we have to start off with where we started.
Okay, when you look at the Constitution, and in this simplicity, it's simple that it was a written plan of government. But to define the Constitution, it's a set of basic principles and laws that governs and gives powers and duties to the government. So with that said, I think, yes, we have to go backward. I do agree with Professor Ford, because we can't talk about this Constitution without talking about the weaknesses that brought us to this place we're at now.
And I think what's interesting off of what Professor Youngblood just said is that when we do take a look at the Constitution, it is in many ways in each section ambiguous as to what it really is telling us as far as how we govern ourselves. And for example, the third article, which talks about the judiciary, it says that there will be a court set up by the federal government to resolve any issues between the states or any people that come from different states. But it doesn't tell us how to go about doing it. Right. Everything that we have now set up is basically been put in afterwards as we try to figure it out.
Yeah, I would add also that it was unique because it really was written. The British tradition was oral, and there were other documents that led up to many of the principles, like the Mayflower Compact, the Magna Carta, and so forth, those principles, and they were included both in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But as stated before, the precursor of it was the Articles of Confederation. And so maybe we should talk a little bit about that, because it really, there were some strengths and certainly some weaknesses within that at the same time too, but because it was an evolution involved with the Constitution. It just didn't happen overnight. So the Articles of Confederation really were set there to really confederate the states, the 13 states. It was a confederation, sort of like the United Nations, so to speak, and it did require a 2/3 vote. One of the major flaws of it is that did not give the power to tax, and that caused weakness, in a sense, amongst this confederation. And with that also, it didn't have the power centrally to over a military. They couldn't pay a military. Actually, what happened was the Navy was sold during that time. And at one time, there's only 80 men that were in the Army. So that was really going to be problematic. So maybe someone else could make some other comments about pros and cons of the Confederation.
I think that one of the aspects about why the Articles failed was the Southern states felt very strongly that the Northern states, which were more mercantile, had more power, and that there was an imbalance. And this eventually is solved for their purposes when we do get to the Constitution and how they figure out the weight of votes within Congress and by the House and by the Senate.
Yeah, well, underlying all of this, of course, is that, and yes, there was certainly this tension between the primarily agrarian South and the primarily industrial, because they were mercantile North, and this notion that they were going to somehow be subservient or outvoted by the bigger states if it was just on a basis of population, and that sounded good at the time. But you see where we are today is that the Constitution of the United States ultimately created a structure where we now live very close to under minority rule. That the majority of states that trend towards ideas and ideals that are not necessarily held by most of us, but they have the majority because they control the states, control the state governments, and if you control the state governments here in the United States, as opposed to again in France, for example, someplace else, you can have really a stranglehold on our government, and so we have that in place. Certainly the articles, and when you have soldiers not being paid, diplomatic relationships were really basically non-existent. It was a mess, I think, to use a very scholarly term, and so they had to do something. But there was always underlying this, and one of the points I certainly wanted to make sure we got out early is who these men were, and they were all men. They're all white males. Most of them today would be considered somewhere in 1%, or certainly the top 5% in terms of income and wealth and what have you. They were all, well educated compared to the American at that particular point in time. And slavery was not even an issue in terms of it was not an existential issue. It was just a question of just how it should be managed within the context of all men are created equal and all this freedom business and what have you. I wrote a longer essay on it, which we talk about hopefully at another point in time. But 8 of the first 10 presidents were slave owners. Okay, and so we kind of start there when we're looking at the United States. Who was in that room in 1787? And these were people like Thomas Jefferson, who thought that slavery was a great thing, and James Monroe. The list kind of goes on. George Washington had slaves till he died, and and that kind of is the I guess the cancer that was built into the American system from the very beginning, because that's who the founders were. Today they'd be called misogynists, of course, because there were no women there. A woman couldn't own real estate in New York City in 1787. And so there's a lot of things that weren't in place that we kind of think would be a consideration going forward at that point in time, but certainly did not happen, was not happening. And we see that reflected to this very day.
Even though the Articles of Confederation in many ways was weak, you also had the state constitutions that kind of trumped the Articles of Confederation. In some cases, they were even giving women the right to vote as early on before the ratification of suffrage. The Articles of Confederation was an attempt at a weak government, and it was created, as we know, on purpose to be weak, but there was things that they did accomplish, and we fail to remember that the Northwest Ordinance or the Land Ordinance of 1785, 1787, these were very important as to bringing in new territories in the West. We also have to look at the factor that during this period of time, we're still at the end of the American Revolution. So at least it brought us halfway together. But the divisions were because of the fear, the reminder of King George III, the reminder of the colonists that they no longer wanted that monarch, which was really created as an executive under the presidency. However, they were ensuring the fact that we, the people, would have some sort of control. And you see it as they looked at, and Dr. Ianniello indicated, the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights. They looked at the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence. And out of all of these and more that I did not name, they also found that these documents influenced rules of law, people holding power, it also limited government, and you can see it starting to evolve somewhat.
Yeah,
Well, I'm sorry, just real, I want to make sure
Yes,
we
sir.
keep this one point, pardon me, real quick, which is that, you see, underlying all of this that was going on, you talk about the Northwest Ordinance and what have you. Well, of course, that was facilitating genocide and land theft,
Okay.
in major ways. It is what it is. And
Mhm.
so when we look about, just the foundations of this nation, I just clearly not going to be a flag waver up here today, and I don't
No,
suggesting anybody is,
your
but
choice.
but these are all things that were built into the Constitution. It's okay to do these kinds of things, and we are still feeling the effects of it to this day. You ask the indigenous people who are left in this country after land theft and genocide, and the Constitution facilitated these kinds of activities, these kinds of direction for the country.
Okay, but would you also agree that those land ordinances provided for the survey of Western lands? And it also provided, I believe, for education. And maybe I'm wrong. I do
Well,
see your
I know
point.
if somebody came into my apartment and started measuring the windows and what have you, I'd say, well, wait a minute, I'm living here. You don't need to measure anything. I
Right.
don't want to get back and forth a lot about it, but it's just, it is what it is. We live with what we are, but I think it's important because what we're discussing right now can't be discussed in Florida public schools, for example, right? Can't talk about genocide, land theft, slavery. Because we have to have this sanitized version of America, and I don't think given the flaws that exist, as Oliver Cromwell once said, "I want you to pay me warts and all." And so I'm happy to point out a few warts.
Yeah, I think what Professor Ford is saying is very true, and we have to understand that. I mean, the truth is the Constitution is basically a license to do certain things to make the 13 colonies be able to function together. And part of that is for the southern states to be able to function within what they feel was an equal way, was to then give partial credit, or in other words, 3/5 of a vote for every slave owned by any southerner. And that makes it therefore functional. And we're giving license to certain things that whether at the time it's morally correct, whether today it's morally correct. This is the means in which they looked at to function as 13 independent countries, for lack of better terms, that now have the Indians to their west, and to the north, they have the French to the north in Canada, and the English as well. And they still have the English possibly coming back, which they do in 1812. So they're basically 13 independent countries, all on their own, looking for how do we protect ourselves from this all falling apart very quickly. And just to what Dr. Youngblood was saying a moment ago, I think what we see was some of the beauty of the writing of the Constitution, where because of the fear of the monarch, Article 1 does not talk about the executive branch, where, of course, most of us concentrate on what we think how our governments run. That's actually Article 2. Article 1 talks about the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, we the people. And Article 3, it talks about the judiciary, the three branches of government that we do learn in high school, that talks about the checks and balances of how government in the United States does function. And one last note, we're talking about the Magna Carta from Dr. Ianniello and other documents. And I think we have to also look at some of the great thinkers that help influence some of the great thinkers which
Like John Locke.
write this. So whether it be Jefferson, Madison, and such, and we have Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes, who talk about the value of man as far as being able to determine their own destiny. And this is part of what the Constitution also talks about.
I just have trouble thinking of Thomas Jefferson or Madison or Monroe or Washington as great thinkers when they are owning people and selling them. And their thoughts, I'll grant, were useful in structuring a governmental process that is copied still to this day around the world. In Vietnam and Cuba and a lot of other places. Conceptually, it was a great idea. Okay, and I think even the terribly flawed human beings like Jefferson or Washington or Monroe can, the clock is right twice a day. Stop clock is right twice a day. So I'll grant that, but I just think that if this entire topic is about myth and mythology, that I just cannot mythologize these people any longer. We grew up, all of us, with that kind of concept, and of course, we probably want to refer to the indigenous people as indigenous people rather than as Indians, as Joe Biden famously did in Vietnam last week with dog-faced pony soldiers and so on. But we digress with respect to that. But I think this is the 21st century, and people prefer to be referred to in that fashion. I just have to mention that.
Just getting back to the Articles of Confederation as a precursor, they thought the strength in that document was that liberty would be through decentralization through the states, and that was one of the biggest weaknesses of it also. And because there wasn't something centrally, there was not having power to do things, so forth, and even to protect the states. They were worried that states would actually have agreements, so it's being taken over by European powers and others. Tyranny was at the heart of prevention in the Constitution. Liberty meant they didn't want to take a chance with tyranny. And tyranny would be not only from above in the government, the new government, so forth, but below. As mentioned before, these people, many of them were aristocracy, so to speak. They were worried that the mobs also would rise up. They were worried about their property and so forth. So somewhat in the context of the time, the Constitution was really the founding fathers were worried about being taken over, or within the government, one power, a monarch or something like that, would take over, but also worrying about below, in a sense. So as mentioned before in the preamble, the preamble is interesting the way they wrote it, because there at the very beginning it is in capital letters, "We the people of the United States." And so that the power was supposed to be coming from the people. The government would get its power from the people, and that's what they set to put into effect during the Second Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia. Many of those original thinkers were not part of the creation of the Constitution. Jefferson was not part of that. He wasn't part of that, didn't partake in that. Franklin did.
We the people
gave
or supposedly gave sovereign power to the people. But I go back to Professor Ford. If you read between the lines, who was not there? Who was not present? So that in itself is a myth, we the people, because those that should have been there were not there. If you were not landowner, if you were not of wealth, if you weren't educated, but if you were a woman, later on, as I mentioned earlier, women are given the right to vote in state constitutions, but those that we the people were not present. And so that's a problem in itself. If you go back to the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. That definitely doesn't apply in many cases, especially today.
Well, it's interesting that when I teach this constitutional law course here at Medgar College, one of the things I point out is that of the so-called democracies, however you want to pitch it these days, this is the only country where the head of state is not elected by a direct vote of the people, and so you get minority rule. You get Donald Trump. You get George W. Bush. I mean, the list kind of goes on, particularly in the modern era of where you have these minority votes, and that pretty much is what we are seeing going forward, because it was designed that way, as being pointed out. It was designed that way from the very beginning. That it wasn't an idea that everybody should have a voice in what was going on, and even when we talk about they talk about people being created equal, of course, slavery, race-based slavery, stayed in Pennsylvania. Actually abolished slavery right around the time of the Constitutional Convention. But outright discrimination as well as slavery was really just part of the American way, and not everybody participated in it, but many people were complicit in it, and institutionally and otherwise. And again, we see that kind of carrying through to the fact that in the 20th century, it was like a big deal for somebody who was Black to go to a formerly all-white school. For goodness sake, how can that even be? The laws of nature are offended. But it's it's built into the American, and I don't know how we get it out of the American bloodstream, quite frankly. But I do think it's important. If we were medical doctors, I imagine we would be saying, well, if there's a disease, how do you get rid of the disease? I think the first thing is to acknowledge what the hell is the disease, what's wrong with this patient, and then what would be, if not a cure, at least a remedy, so that it's not as bad as what we see to this very day.
I think that's about how do we get out of this. The founding fathers who wrote this, they didn't see it, even what democracy would be, political parties would be, economic and social policies that would develop in this young nation. But they realized changes had to be made to this document. It was a very basic document, and that's the amendments. And so I think that that's how they really envisioned it, that it was not going to be a perfect government. They were not going to cover everything. They had basic things as far as liberty and other things as far as the separation of powers and so forth. But the amendments still today is available. And although the last one, I think, was 1987, was a long time ago in a sense, but that's the way that things could be changed or added and so forth. And of course, they could.
Yeah, well, since the Big Ten, right? Since then, there's only been 17 amendments in the following 230 something years, and one could argue that in terms of really substance of the type that Professor Ianniello is talking about, I'd vote for the 13th, 14th, 15th amendments certainly. After that, it's setting up a national revenue system, income tax, you should a prohibition. And repealing prohibition, and there shouldn't have even been a need to, quote, give women the right to vote, except that it was needed. And you really just, and again, what I've just learned, and sometimes we learn by teaching, of course, is that because I took constitutional law in law school and all that, but really, this nation's laws have not been changed a lot if you start with the Constitution over all of these years. But what's remarkable is that through interpretation and adaptation, depending upon who's interpreting, the Constitution can be adapted to any number of things. The same Constitution that where the Supreme Court said that Roe v. Wade gave women certain rights with respect to rights of privacy, that same Constitution was not changed, not a letter between that and the Dobbs decision. So what changed? What changed? Actually, more Americans were in support of Roe v. Wade's concepts by the time Dobbs comes along. But from a political process, we wind up with a Supreme Court that is absolutely not representative of anything that we most people would think it makes sense. But of course, the Supreme Court rules. The last thing I'll mention with respect to that is, and to just prove or accentuate this interpretation adaptation business. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. It's race-based segregation endorsed by the states is fine. Okay, we go 58 years. 58 years, there's not a single change to the Constitution that takes place between 1896 and 1954. The only thing that changed is this country change. The only thing that changed, obviously, you had new other Supreme Court justices, but you also had, Black people fighting with white people in World War I, World War II, the Renaissance. And what I tell students, I think was perhaps the biggest mover of the day was 1947 when Jackie Robinson played baseball. And he said, oh, come on. But in 1947, so-called Major League Baseball would be the equivalent of the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, all of those things put together. That was what it was, sacrosanct. And that changed. And then 7 years later, you get Brown versus Board of Education. Didn't change the Constitution at all, changed the interpretation of it. And the Constitution is adapted, which is why we have never had a new Constitution all these years, because it's been adapted to various times and circumstances.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Professor Ford just elaborated. It's amazing, in essence, that how slow the government functions itself to make change, and it does so by small court decisions, by having certain judges in place who who change with the ideas of what the people are through generations. And as we just mentioned, we now see a Supreme Court that is in essence totally out of step with what the majority of most Americans see for any number of issues. And it is a way for, in essence, for the old establishment to try to hold on to what was versus what the country has evolved in, whether we want to phrase it as enlightenment, growing up, correcting errors that were the original sin that was first placed upon the country with the Constitution. The Constitution has to be just a framework, and it's going to take men and women who see what was originally put in place and understanding that democracy and with the laws in which we put in play on guidelines, and that we have to always be introspective in what we see around us as to what we want to be now.
Well, moving on from that, I'm curious if one of the things I wrote down is that the ideas behind our government is that we're governed by laws instead of men, but it certainly seems, if you pay attention to the news, that we may be completely reversing that tendency. Now we're being run by men instead of laws. What do we do about that? How are there mechanisms in place that the Constitution gives us to try and flip that around again, so that we can actually once again put the laws in there in the place where they cover everybody rather than just the friends of the powerful?
I at the risk of, I don't want to be a contrarian, but I don't know when it's ever really been for the people. Again, you look at who designed the Constitution, and they designed it, that's going to benefit them the most. And in many ways, that has taken place, to your point, to this day. I go back to that notion of adaptation, and since we're talking about myths and non-myths with respect to the Constitution, you think about it, when the Constitution was ratified in 1787, 1788, was written and ratified, this was a very small country. It was a very small country, hugging the east coast of the North American continent. There were some territories off to the west that Dr. Youngblood referred to, but it's a very small country. Not certainly no navy, as mentioned, not a lot of things. And they had cities that were one day be great cities, but weren't there. It was a very small country with high aspirations. That was 1787. We just go fast forward. Was it 16 years later? And it is a country that now is larger than every country on the planet except the Russian Empire through the Louisiana Purchase. All of a sudden, you have a continental government that was really only a couple of the framers of the Constitution ever had any really, maybe after the third glass of rum or something, said, yeah, we could just have this whole big country. But it really was, it was a very parochial view that that America had, and all of a sudden it's this great big country, and it had to adapt to that. It had to adapt to everything that we can think of, from telephones and telegraphs to satellites and automatic weapons and all kinds of things that have changed this country in so many different ways that they couldn't possibly have conceived of in those days. And yet the Constitution still works. Not perfectly. I think I'm not surprising anybody by saying that, I'm sure, but not perfectly. But it works enough that you have a functioning government and a functioning economy, which could certainly be a lot better. And it is that adaptation principle. You don't have to. Lord knows what it would look like if we had a constitutional convention today. It would be like a comedy show, I think, of some sort. But but through adaptation, it's adapted to these various major changes on the planet, for goodness sake. But it still has its flaws, and I think it's that but part that people are loath to address because it somehow sounds unpatriotic or just not giving enough credence to what was done. Yeah, it was quite an effort to get even as far as it got in terms of establishing something that sounds like rights, something that sounds like responsibility, something that sounds like a government that's supposed to be of the people and by the people and for the people, as opposed to not. And but that's where we find ourselves in 2023, trying to make the aspirations somehow something resembling reality. We're far from it today.
I don't know if going back to what you were asking, Jonathan,
Right.
Whether we can talk about the present political atmosphere in the country. There are individuals who do obtain power, and being human, there are going to be some that will just bluntly say are more selfish for themselves than they are for other things. We try within the Constitution to put some brakes on it, whether it be by limiting the amount of terms you can have, whether it be by having the judiciary. When we talk about the judiciary, we talk about the Supreme Court, where you have a lifetime appointment, which was supposed to take out the political element, because then you wouldn't be beholden to have to favor one side or the other. Now that you couldn't be fired, you can show any type of issue to me and to Professor Ford, Professor Youngblood, Professor Ianniello, and we can each take it apart and find the pros and the cons to suit whatever our needs are. And that will always go on. Is there a means to take that so that we eliminate this potentiality of a monarchy or tyranny once again arising within these grounds? It depends upon us. One of the things why we hold today for everybody, not just students and professors, is for an educational purposes, is so that we take a look and we discuss these type of issues, so we are more educated. We become better, knowledgeable when it comes time to vote, and put people in place that hopefully will govern for the people and not just for their own selfish interests.
I was thinking about checks and balances. It's already placed into the Constitution, but are we really using it correctly? Have we forgotten that the purpose is to ensure that all three branches of the federal government do not overlap each other? And it appears, as you mentioned earlier, that there's a conflict going on inside of the three branches, and it's becoming more and more evident. So who's checking who? It's already written down, the process for each of the three branches, but yet, do we see it carrying out in its full totality? And I think if we look at what is in the Constitution that is written, and I'm not saying the Constitution is what will solve the issues, but it's written down. It's written down for us to follow. And the problem is today we're not following. We're doing based on whoever's in office or those political constituents, whether they're progressive or whatever, that have more power, okay? Maybe not political power, but funding power. Something needs to be done. But what? We have to go back where we started from. And the starting point was the Constitution. If it lasted this many years, we can't allow systems or ideas to change what was not broken. And I think that's where we're at to ensure what the Constitution has given to all of us, to give that opportunity. You have, what is it called? The Supremacy Clause, the Elastic Clause. You have that when need arise. But are we taking advantage of that? The executive branch, the judicial branch? I don't know. It's a very difficult question that you just asked because of what we're seeing today in front of us. Knowing, if you know the Constitution and what it represents and what it has already put in place for us as a nation, for a government, for the states, or even working together, state and government, why isn't it not working today?
I think also, you're so right about the separation of powers and the checks and balances put into it, but we're living in a glacial time. The country is so divided now, and divided even at the far ends of the parties, that the center is having a hard time. And democracy is messy. It takes a while, with the system we have. I mean, other forms of governments, which we don't like and don't want here, they just do things in a sense.
Okay.
But this takes time, and unfortunately, over the history, a lot of things have not come about through that time, and now stuck in the middle, government, and I think it's the political scene, especially now, is the fact that the country is so divided on things, depending on polls, depending on the elections, so forth, that we're in a position now that we're, it's stuck.
I think that one of the things George Washington saw it at the very beginning.
Yes.
When the Constitution was into play, and he was now president, and his fear was that the political parties would rise and come up and divide the people. And going with what Dr. Ianniello was just referencing, how do we solve this? Then maybe now is the time, because we have put ourselves now on a spectrum. It doesn't matter where you fall even within your party. If there's someone too far to the left, that means everyone else to the right is where you fall. Or if you're one way or the other, there's no such thing as the middle anymore, because the middle just got immersed, where if you're not with me, you have to be with them. So is it that we need to create a third party, in essence, to maybe have it as a means to solve some of these issues, so that those people that do feel that they're not spoken for, or more importantly, are being dragged into one of the two sides, where they don't feel even comfortable in being one of the two sides? There is the silent majority that is in the middle. and we maybe need to find a political solution to some of these constitutional questions.
Mhm.
I agree with what you said earlier, Professor Wald. In paraphrasing my version of what George Washington, when he was retiring, he said that the political parties will eventually, going forward, destroy the nation. And I'm just paraphrasing in my own way. And we have seen it. So by having two political parties, we have like the Green Party, we have the Independent Party, we have the Liberal Party. There's a third party. Will a third party give us that balance that we need? I think political parties in essence have been the downfall. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Youngblood mentioned a few minutes ago going backwards and for inspiration, and I'm wondering if we could get, because it's not a founding document per se, but it's a source of ideas about how the federal government would be organized and why and to what extent, being, of course, the Federalist Papers. Most people never read this collection of documents because, frankly, it's taught as an afterthought when it's taught at all. I'm wondering if the panelists could give us a bit of a background as to what actually the Federalist Papers say and what manner of influence they had on the origins of the form the Constitution finally took.
Well, you have the anti-federalists, someone like Patrick Henry, who smelled a rat, who really felt that we were in trouble as a nation, especially the fact that there was no Bill of Rights. The Federalists, who approved of the Constitution and what it stood for, wanted to convince the country. And so the Federalist Papers were rolled out. I think one of the famous ones, and someone can help me with this, was Federalist Paper 10. To encourage and motivate and move the country along, the people along, in order to ratify, especially the states to ratify. So I just gave a little background someone can pick up.
I think the Federalist Papers, in essence, were each of the participants were asked to give their ideas of what were the important issues that needed to be included within the Constitution. So basically, it was homework assignments, which were then published. And for the people to read, a Federalist was someone who wanted the 13 counties to come together under a federal government, whereas Dr. Youngblood was referencing Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist, wanting to know his state to have the greater power, and that there was a loose confederation, the Articles of Confederation, where we would just find ways to work with each other. But basically, I don't want New York telling Georgia, where I live, how to operate under Georgia law. And this is some of the arguments that were going back and forth amongst these papers as to why you needed to come together. And there's some beautiful, beautiful writing, which unfortunately has been lost unless you have an opportunity to read these,
Right.
which I had to do as an undergrad in class. It's some great writing. It's really is something, great American treasures.
Okay. All right. Again, fine. Okay. how is the Constitution organized in the term? We know that's the articles and versus the amendments. We don't really have the time to do a deep dive on any of this because, you know, the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, we could be here all night. But just to give a general idea as to what the why the individual facets were organized the way they were, the order in which they appeared, the length and necessary brevity that they had for the entries that they've got. Was that done, you know, purely because it just ended up being that way because you ended up having a notation by a committee, or were they more specific and more purposeful that way?
It's been said actually that they were using the types of government that were already in existence to form the separation of powers. The idea of monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. So what they knew there was a strong figurehead and a monarchist. So the idea of the president would now fill that type of a role. That's what governments had at that time, monarchies, especially Europe at that time. But the difference, of course, that this one would be elected, and by the way, the electoral college there too. The aristocracy, there was some room for them because that originally was the idea that would be the Senate, like it was in Rome during that time. And originally they were not voted upon. They were really selected by that time. And then the democratic idea would, of course, be the House, where the idea that whereas the Senate would be for 6 years, this would be just a shorter term, 2 years. But the qualification there that those people still had to be property owners to be in that. So the history really, you know, as far as the form of the three parts, and of course there's judicial at the same time, comes from what they experienced before. But the idea is that they did not want any one of these to be all-powerful, to be tyrannical. That was the fear. And that's where they brought in the checks and balances and the separation of these two.
Excuse me, Director Frater, we have a hand raised in our audience. I just wanted to mention that to you. Professor Meyer has her hand raised.
Okay.
I can ask her to speak if you'd like.
Absolutely, Professor Meyer.
Hear you.
Okay, hi, how are you? Okay, I don't know how to turn on my picture, but it doesn't matter. I think this has been a wonderful conversation, and I personally feel that one of the most important parts of the Constitution is the separation of church and state. And what that brings to mind, that a couple of things I want to say. One is what's going on in Israel and how they are protesting and trying to figure out whether the Supreme Court should be below or above the Congress, which is an interesting idea, and how the complete left has really taken hold, and how the people don't feel that they're represented, the majority of people, even though the election went that way. So, you know, there's some similarities in terms of what's happening in our country. The other thing I wanted to mention was a couple of things. One, I just recently came across some statistics. I don't know if you saw The Sound of Freedom, but it's a wonderful movie. And it talked about at the end that there's more slavery today than existed many years ago, which really shocked me. So that is very problematic. The other thing was that, you know, I was thinking in terms of how the Electoral College is a debatable issue. And I was wondering how any of you were thinking about that, because, you know, one of you mentioned how George Bush and Donald Trump were elected because of the Electoral College. And in terms of the third party, I don't know, every time there's been a third person running for president, it really has screwed up the result of the election. So I'm not certain about that. So those are my comments. So I really commend you for your presentation. Thank you.
Fran, just to mention a statement on the Electoral College. The Constitution never created a college. They created electors.
Right.
And so that in itself is a check off. Probably why today, from going back in time, I remember learning about the Electoral College. And I was told that that was purpose because the founding fathers, those at the Constitution, feared that the average quote person would not allow the right person to be
Elected.
in a position.
Yeah.
Professor Meyer, you brought up a lot of interesting topics. In regards to your church and state question, the First Amendment actually does not stipulate about the separation of church and state. It says that the government shall establish no church for the people, therefore, to have to follow. I know it sounds like a little small detail in language, but language is exactly what the Constitution is about and why we have all these battles in courts. In regards to your question about Israel, the problem that's occurring in Israel at present, which is because there is no constitution in Israel, and therefore the debate that's happening as far as the Supreme Court and whether it does have power, to what power it has, there is no resolution to it because it's never been established to what power they actually do have and where it lays within the political structure in the state of Israel. And as far as the Electoral College, this is an antiquated idea that needs to, in my opinion, go. I understand your statement that a third party has basically, from what you state, created problems and screwed up elections, but that also depends upon from where you're sitting. Those that found that their candidate happened to win out in those issues, well, then they're happy. But I think the Electoral College is long overdue to go into the ways of history. It was put into one of the reasons it was put into play was to again give some power to the southern states. But those issues were retired once the Civil War was over and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were put into play, where we don't need that anymore to equate everything. And just finally, Dr. Ianniello, you're correct as far as the Senate, as far as being aristocracy. Actually, the governors of each state, until it was amended, were to select their senators, and this also created an imbalance as far as from a political structure. And now, of course, we elect our senators every 6 years.
And I may add to that about the separation of church and state in this country. You know, the idea that the government had to be neutral, cannot in any way promote religion. And the idea that you hear some saying that this nation basically is based upon Judeo-Christian principles and was a Judeo-Christian. Well, actually, that's not the case when you think about it, because the founding fathers were really deists, most of them. Their ideas from the Enlightenment, Jefferson, Paine, and so forth. So that was not something that was there originally. Historically, at least, there's no proof of that in that sense.
So if you pardon me for adding on to that, you know, a lot of the people who were around in 1787 either had a personal experience or were descendants of people who had left Europe because of religious oppression. It was like very serious to be a Catholic in some parts of the world, to be a Jew in some parts of the world, to be a Muslim, and to be what kind of Protestant you were. And the whole idea was, in part, this notion of freedom of religion was that we don't want a state-based religion. I mean, it's like real basic, which is why it's fascinating to watch what's going on right now where you do have any number of initiatives saying, legislative initiatives saying that the entire cost of private school, religious schools should be paid for out of the public treasury. And I don't have any, prejudice against if somebody wants to have an Islamic school or a Jewish school or a Catholic school, but how? To say how the heck, but that's not appropriate. But how the hell are we supposed to pay for that if I don't particularly adhere to that religion? I grew up at a time where we had to say the Our Father in public school in New Jersey from 5th grade through to probably about 8th and 9th grade. And then of course the Supreme Court finally said, because I grew up a Catholic, and the Our Father that we were speaking was the Protestant version. And if you were Jewish, it's like, what the heck is this about? And we were.
My hand
Yeah, we
raised.
were doing that kind of activity. So it is. It's amazing how again it goes back to what I said before about interpretation.
You can raise your hand.
Okay.
You can interpret, depending on who's doing the interpreting of the same Constitution, you can come up with some very different, very crazy results. So it's important to determine who's doing the interpreting, because that's kind of where we are to this day. And and I know you mentioned before with the lifetime terms for the Supreme Court justices and all federal judges, as a matter of fact, you can have certain philosophies frozen in amber, depending upon who's president and who gets the number of vacancies. Donald Trump got 300 vacancies. Those people are with us for the rest of our lives. I hope we live a long, long time. We're gonna have to live longer than that to outlive those people. Okay, and they'll be there, making their interpretation based upon what the Federalist Society has said, and organizations to the right of the Federalist Society, if you can imagine such a thing. So we have a problem. We have a real problem.
Professor Ford, thank you for talking about the schools. I'm going to use that as a segue to talk about civics education. Professor Meyer, Youngblood, and myself are in the education program, and we hear a lot about the moaning that it's not taught in the schools and so forth. And truthfully, when we speak to our teacher candidates, social studies is not really emphasized, unfortunately, but it is supposed to be. And just to let you know, in New York State, the social studies curriculum, Standards 1 and Standards 5, deal with civics, especially more so Standard 5, which deals with the Constitution. And actually, in New York City, the social studies grade 7, unit 3, deals exclusively with the Constitution and also federalism. And but it also goes into those other documents we mentioned before that were the foundational for the beliefs in the federal. It's interesting of what they're asking the students to do. They are asking them to use their critical thinking skills when it comes to the Constitution. They're asking them to develop a job posting for the president. I thought that was interesting. Draft and publish letters to the Congress, create an essay about the essential question, what do people create, structure, and change their governments? Why do people strengthen governments? So there is that, at least and more, but we bemoan the fact that the schools are not, all schools are not doing that. And I think Professor Youngblood, you probably, although you were in the schools, you was mostly on the secondary level, right? More so.
No, I had K to 12.
Yeah, K to 12.
K to 12.
Yeah.
Well, and it was lacking tremendously in the elementary.
So what we're talking about here, yes, thank you. What we're talking about here is very, very important for the Constitution and the use of the knowledge of the Constitution, because so many surveys have been done where the average citizen, and truthfully, I think we all had to brush up on this, right? In a sense, don't really know what's in, what's not in the Constitution. And when they read the news and they read about separation of powers or various clauses, they don't understand. And they'll just be like the wind going back and forth, not thinking critically.
I think that Dr. Ianniello is so right on point. In fact, I read somewhere recently that immigrants who are taking their test to become citizens know more about the Constitution
Yes.
than our
Yes.
school children do.
Yeah, it's a requirement.
Yeah. And adults.
Than adults.
Yeah.
At some point, I downloaded the citizenship exam, and I think it's 20 basic questions as an overview, and you don't do the whole thing. But you know, if you get a score of 15 or more, you're considered knowledgeable, and I ended up with 17. But some of them, you know, some of those questions are actually quite complex. You really do have to know how the entire system of works, what the three parts of government are, what the bicameral, you know, House and Senate is. And that's not something, you know, we pick it up because you hear about it all the time, but actually sitting down and memorizing these things takes time and energy. A lot of American students don't have that kind of time or energy because they're doing so many other things. We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I have a couple of really wacky things to come up to sit with, because this is one of the, during my research, I had a section called "That's Not in the Constitution," and I specifically pointed to people who had their pocket constitutions with them and they read them all the time. And over the course of how that develops, a lot of folks think that it's because it's not in their pocket constitution, it isn't real. It's not a real law. And that comes from the fact that we don't recognize a lot of the times that the Constitution is not an all-encompassing document. It is a guide to how laws are read, how they are interpreted, and how they are administered. And for instance, you know, does the term presumed innocent until proven guilty appear in the Constitution?
No.
No.
Just trial by jury.
Correct. It is the Constitution does not actually require proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, nor does it guarantee a presumption of innocence, but numerous amendments do regulate the state and the rights of those accused of a crime. There was a question about whether the Constitution guarantees you the right to enter a store or restaurant.
Yeah, I would let me take a swing at that.
Okay.
Which is that and one of the things again I teach my students is that all rights have limits. Okay, no rights are not unlimited. They, you know, or without restrictions somehow. So you know, the Chief Oliver Wendell Holmes said years ago, you have freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Okay, well, and that, you know, we have religious freedom, but human sacrifice is probably not something that's going to work in this country, right? And so, you know, asking freedom to enter a restaurant, I'm not quite sure. You know, that has a lot of conditions. Yeah, are you walking into a restaurant naked? Because then, you know, perhaps the owner would have certain dress codes, no pun intended, you know, with respect to that, or or have a dress code. You need to wear a tie or formal attire, and you want to come in flip flops, and no, that's not the kind of place we have. That would be a reasonable restriction. You know, you are from the Sikh religious order, and you have a turban on. I can't refuse you for that because your religion says you're going to wear, you know, certain headdress, and I've got to respect that. So I don't think it's possible to answer that question without saying what else is in that story there. As I said, walking into a restaurant naked might work if that's a naked restaurant. You know, I don't know that I particularly want to dine there personally, but you know, if that's how they roll, no pun intended, then that's how they roll. You know, but I'd have to know more details. As I said, no rights are unlimited, including the Second Amendment, which has now been interpreted that you can own 25 machine guns and it's okay. That's not what the Constitution says. If anybody would take the time to read the 4 lines to the Constitution, they would know that that's not the case. Anyway, I rest my case.
Fair enough. It turns out that, well, according to what I found out, the Constitution does not, in fact, guarantee anyone the right to enter a restaurant or a store. The case called Pruneyard Shopping Center versus Robbins decided that no such constitutional right exists, even if the goal is to express one's First Amendment rights to free expression. And of course, there's more case law on that. That's one example I picked. No taxation without representation.
Not in the Constitution.
No.
More or less unanimous, and it turns out that's true. That it's a Revolutionary War era sentiment that is not actually embodied in the Constitution. And to this day, residents of Washington, D.C., undocumented immigrants, incarcerated individuals, American children, and a great many other demographics all pay taxes without having the benefit of representation in American politics. Got time for one more. This was my favorite. Everyone likes this one, but they don't know why. Here we go. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need.
Yeah, well, that sounds, I think in this day and age, it'd be fairly considered a Marxist statement or a socialist statement or something like that. Elon Musk is not in favor of it. I guarantee you that. And I don't know where you'd find that in today's interpretation of the Constitution, but provide for the general welfare. That is a clause in the amendment which is in the initial I guess Article 1. I guess no, in the preamble to the Constitution, excuse me, provide for the Commonwealth, which has been used to justify everything from Social Security to Medicare to health care and a number of other things. So we do have some way of interpreting the Constitution to say if it's not each according to his or her needs, at least that the government has a responsibility to do more for people, which was relatively new. Going into the end of the 19th century, folks were saying the government doesn't have any responsibility to take care of people. And then there's the general welfare clause was used to interpret the Constitution. Didn't change the Constitution, just reinterpret it. Amen.
Amen, indeed. It's true that phrase does not, in fact, appear in the Constitution. It does appear in the Bible, and it's quoted. It was adopted by Karl Marx, and it did appear in the USSR's Constitution, but not ours. And finally, many people are convinced that the Constitution establishes English as the official language of the United States. We're getting nods, which is true. It does not. 18th century America was a land of many languages, French, Dutch, German, English, and were all in wide use. The founding fathers were famously nearly all multilingual, not all of them, but many of them had fluency or working fluency in more than one language. Okay, we've got 2 minutes left, and
one quick thing on that. In Philadelphia, 1787, there was a debate of what would be the national language. Just in the Constitution, it was a toss-up between English and German. And because a lot of people spoke German, and I always wonder if German had been the adopted language of the United States, the Temptations would be singing Mein Frau instead of My Girl, and just don't know how that would sound.
There's a terrific alternate history book in there somewhere. All right, we've got a couple minutes left. I would like to know if the panelists would like to make any parting remarks.
I do, I wish. As I mentioned to the panelists, there's an excellent book out. It's probably a bestseller on the Wall Street Journal list, and it's called The Quartet. It's written by Joseph Ellis. I don't know if you can see it, but as I mentioned before, this deals with the viewpoints of the dysfunctions created under the Articles of Confederation and the manipulation of the political process. Then probably we can make connection today, but it is worth picking up and looking at the comments of those great founding fathers and how they went about to finally ratify the Bill of Rights and assure state compliance. So it's called The Quartet by Joseph E. Ellis. Thank you.
I just want to say, I think this was a wonderful exercise amongst ourselves. Thank you for the privilege. I think we have a responsibility to our students here at MCNY
Yeah,
to, whenever we can, depending on what area we're studying or something, in some way, something must be related to the Constitution, and maybe bring that out, let that be a discussion. You know, we're assuming that the students maybe don't know that much about it, but maybe we'll be very surprised. And we would, you know, that discussion should not just be on one day a year like this, but really should be throughout the year. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Professor Wald.
I think this has been a fantastic exercise. I enjoy, of course, listening to everybody with their opinions. I think this is part of what we need to do as Americans is listen to everybody, and even if you don't agree with their particular perspective, you can't learn if you don't listen. And you can find that even if you don't agree ultimately with what their perspective is, what it does is give you at least knowledge, and it also gives you knowledge in how you can better structure and support your position and try to persuade somebody with what your ideas are. Communication is everything as far as democracy goes. And as long as we are willing to communicate, we have the opportunity to make this a better country.
And Professor Ford.
This is known as my twin brother is sick today, so I'm kind of double. But just in closing, I would just say to students in particular, regardless of regardless, you should learn about the Constitution. You can get weird. You can get one of these on Amazon for $1.75. You know, and I'm not suggesting you read it cover to cover, but when you see somebody talking about the Second Amendment, you see people talking about, oh, I don't know, whatever it is they say is in the Constitution, you can read that. But most importantly, and this is a message I leave to all students, whatever course I'm teaching, please, please, please stay with the current events. Understand what's going on today. Yeah, you know, reading about history without understanding what's going on today is like, you know, trying to row a boat with a big hole in it. It's not going to work. You need to understand what's going on in current events today, and not just who the president, mayor, and the governor are, but what is actually going on. Most people in America do not vote. It's an amazing, amazing truth, but it is true. Most Americans, it's less than 50% vote. I remember when I was doing a lot of work in South Africa as an attorney, people stayed in lines 5 miles long in order to vote. Percent participation because they'd been denied to vote. I don't know. I hope we don't have to go through that here in this country before we figure out that it's really damn important to vote. But if you vote with no knowledge, that's actually worse than not voting at all, because then you get Donald Trump. That's a whole other story. But quite seriously, please, please, please stay current with what's going on in this city, country, and in this world, because it affects you. Whatever your major is, whatever your profession is, you need to know more about what's going on around you than you know today. Thank you.
And thank you, Patrick Ianniello, Roberta Youngblood, Wallace Ford, and Mark Wald. I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for being part of this program today, and thank you for giving me your time and attention as we organize this panel. And I hope to see you at next year's Constitution Day panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.